In the words of the great Babadook arts, I want that. Very nice.
This is ground affected. My name is your dad, and welcome to dropping your chicken tendy because you got way too many in your hands, you greedy pig. Recently, one of the patrons had mentioned that I should draw something that was affected. So what I decided to do was draw a 3D printer that was actually affected by whatever it is that it's affected by, since this is ground affected. Whatevs, bruh. Anyway, I drew this character. People seem to like the character, so we made the character. This was sculpted for me by C27 Miniatures and Terrain. And today, I'm going to be releasing the files for this model so you can paint your own affected 3D printer. The model does come apart, so if you're a little bit clued up with 3D modeling programs, you might be able to add an SD slot space or something like that to the bottom part of it so that you can have it hold SD cards or just put whatever you want to put inside of it. I decided to make mine really small just to try and keep time constraints under control in some kind of way or shape or form. You might as well just click like and subscribe now, because I can guarantee by the end of this video I'll have earned that from you. And if not, you can just follow the instructions that I give in the last few minutes of the video. Also, if you don't know already, I have merch link in description and Patreon link in description. Thanks for coming. Please watch my video. This is the one time that I actually appreciated using a zenithal highlight for painting this model. And to start off with, I'm going to make use of that zenithal using this fluorescent green from Army Painter's airbrush range. Staying within the airbrush range, I'm going to use this awesome teal type blue that I found as part of a triad. And yeah, while this color does not completely match my original drawing, it's close enough to be good enough for me. I start out with the majestic fortress, I move on to the elemental bolt, and then go over the top of all of that with a psychic shock. And as we can see, the base colors are already ready. Using Drakenhof Nightshade, I'm gonna spray that into the shadows of the blue. I also sprayed that into the green, but I didn't show that part. I needed to highlight some of the green, so I added a tiny bit of demonic yellow into the fluorescent green to create a highlight on the base. Now for painting those maggots, I'm gonna use a skin tone. Kinda weird, I know, they're meant to be pink, but technically it is kind of a pink. I wanted them to appear gross looking, so I'm also going to give them a gloss coat later as well. I painted the vents just with a dark grey because I'm going to come back later and I'm going to add a wash to give some depth to it. Then moving on to painting the mouth. Starting off with the mouth, it seems complicated when you look at it, but it's not when you break it down into small sections, each of their own color segment that you need to paint. So starting off, we're going to paint the purple that is the base color of the entire mouth essentially. While that's drying, I'm going to do a couple of highlights on the worm. Taking a black, I'm going to put that into the nose of the zombie. This is obviously going to create the depth, and I drew it with a black nose, so it's going black. I also added Drakenhof Nightshade as a wash around the edge of the brain poking out the top end, and I also add that around the sockets of the eyes. While that's all drying, I go back to painting a dark grey onto the inside of the USB and the plug for this. And then base coated the worms on the bottom part of the base. Now to go back to that purple that we let dry, and I'm going to add a pink over the top of it, and I'm going to slowly work this up. So I'm going to start off with it kind of light and really thin, and then I'm going to make it brighter and brighter towards the center. To do the teeth, I mixed a white with a brown to create an almost off-white, dirty white look. This I'm going to highlight later. For the slime or drool that's coming out of his mouth, I just went straight plain pure white, because the contrast is going to be stark and it's going to be bold. While that dried, I gave the highlights to the worms on the base. And I went back in and I did a second layer of white, because white never really covers as well as you want it to. Working on the eyes, I'm going to start off with a light grey, let's say 20% grey. I give a good solid base coat over the entire eye, being careful to make sure the shape is perfectly round at this point. Then I take a little bit of white and I mix it into the grey, and this is going to be the next step up in the gradient that's on the insides of his eyes. While that dries, I'm going to paint the pink onto his brain. This is the same pink I used as the highlight in the gums. Now that the eyes are dry, I'm going to water down my white quite a lot and use a glaze to slowly bring up the highlight on the eye. Using that same off-white mix, I'm going to add more white back into it, and I'm going to start to highlight the tops of the teeth. While they dry, I'm going to go back to the eyes and add another layer of highlights. Then it's time to add the spots. At first I added them the wrong color, but I realized if I just mixed all the colors, I got the right color in the end. I then edge highlighted around the edge because my style of drawing has a lot of white highlights, and I wanted to make sure that those stood out on the model as if it was my drawing. This also helps to create a little bit more depth between your foreground and your background as well. I went back in with one final highlight on the eyes, and then I took a gloss and I glossed everything in the mouth, all the worms, his eyes and his brain. This is because it's going to give you a good contrast between the matte paints and the gloss paints that are on the teeth and on the eyes. This is going to make these parts separate from each other and help give them a little bit more of a believable wet eyeball teeth look. For the base of the printer, I'm going to start painting the wires coming out the back compartment. And of course, there's only two wires, so it's obviously going to be a red and a black wire. And while those are drying, I'm going to go back into the mouth and I'm going to paint the rest of the purple. I don't think it's necessary to paint the entire top plate of this base purple. If you're not going to use it as some kind of box or compartment thing, you could probably just leave this and glue it together and it wouldn't matter. Using a blue, a pretty light blue, I'm going to paint the tongue. This is going to be the base for what I'm going to do later. Going on to those wires at the back, I'm going to use a dark red at first. This is going to be the base color and also our shadow. Then I'm going to take a lighter red and I'm going to feather that over the top of that. This is going to give us a look as if I've shaded this wire. For the actual wire coming out of the silicone part of the wire, I'm going to use a chrome marker paint. This is going to make it look quite realistic as well. And while that stuff's drying, I'm going to add a wash into the vents on the side of the printer. I then used a normal metallic silver, which burst all over my wet palette, but it's okay. With this far, we might as well do it. And I used that to paint the little screws that should technically be holding this panel onto the back of the machine. I then edge highlighted with a little bit of yellow around that panel. Going back into the mouth, I made sure to finish painting off the gums, and while that dries, I went back and highlighted those little wires on the back. Back into the mouth again, and I'm going to use Drakenhof Nightshade as a wash over the entire tongue, and just before that's completely dried, I'm going to come back in with that same light blue and add a layer over the top. This is going to be the second layer in the line of highlights on the tongue. Then that same mix I made for the upper teeth, I used to paint the lower teeth. And while the teeth were drying, I added the highlights onto the tongue. Using white, I painted the drool coming out the bottom of his mouth, and once that had all been painted, I used a clear gloss and I painted the insides of the mouth and the worms or maggots coming out of him before painting the little spots of disease on the lower part of this base. Again, I just mixed all the colors together for this.
The thunder roared, echoing through the house, through a small space between the curtains. Occasional flashes of lightning poked through, lighting up portions of the room. The old 3D printer sat on a dusty shelf, untouched. Windows were smashed, doors were broken, and a sickly aroma flooded the air. Maggots swarmed the carpeted floor, reaching towards the printer. They crawled into any entry they could find. At last, the printer felt alive after sitting on those shelves year after year. Its blank eyes opened wide, his teeth rotted, and drool filled his mouth. As the printer turned, it rattled and creaked. Maggots crawled out of its head as it sighed, laughed, wondering what it was about to do next. The printer fell. Darkness took over. Soon it woke up, and it seemed to be that same stormy night. Looking around at the surroundings, we can only assume the printer has been placed on someone's doorstep. Again, the thunder roared, and a bright flash of lightning hit the printer. How am I alive? And why am I different? The printer muttered to himself.
Hopefully that this video gave you some kind of insight on how I painted my miniature zombie 3D printer effected thing. And if it did, I'd like to see your own take. And if you would like to paint one of your own one of these, have a look in the description for the link to buy the files for this specific model. Most of the proceeds go straight towards the artist who sculpted the model. It was my idea, but he did most of the work for making it come to life. And of course, if you paint your own one, please hashtag it with Ground Affected on Instagram so that I can see them and share them in my own stories and let other people see what you come up with yourself. And we're at the end of the video where most people have already left, so it doesn't really matter what we say right now, and I could just probably say Patreon, Patreon, Patreon. Also, link in description. And very importantly, I need to thank one of the new patrons we got this last week, which is 3D Wicked themselves. Thank you, dude, so much for all your support. Thank you to all the patrons who support the channel. It's because of you guys that I'm able to keep these lights blind to me. That's why I have to wear a hat inside. Of course, if you like the video, like and share, and leave a comment in the section below, because we also know if you don't do that, your next print will 100% fail. Or you might wake up with a spider in your bed. I'm not really sure which one of those two will happen, so to be safe, leave a like, leave a comment, and then you can move on. And if you didn't like any of that, there's only one thing I can probably say, to be fair. Just click dislike and f*** off, bro. God damn, there is a mustache hair in my nose and it is so itchy.